Before we move on to rodent control, I just had one comment related to the potential use of heat as a way to control slugs, especially their eggs, in certain kinds of situations. So hot water is a very effective method of controlling slugs and snails as well. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about
move the chat box.
All right, thank you. Where's Can you maybe move your chat box? Sorry, I'm kind of a neophyte here.
Sorry, I got it.
How do I? I've got so many legs.
Hold on, we're just having a little bit of a pause here while we get the PowerPoint to move through. There you go.
Okay.
That means you're gonna be getting tied up now.
Right. Well, so there are a lot of reasons to control rodents, and there are probably a lot of food safety issues related to them as well, in addition to rat lungworm. Among them are leptospirosis. Hawaii has a pretty high incidence of that, and in some years it actually exceeds all the rest of the states combined. Lepto is of particular concern to some agricultural environments, especially wetland production, and then also related to some kinds of post-harvest kinds of situations as well, especially where there's a lot of water being utilized. Of course, we're here today with the intent of working to control and stop rat lungworm, so that's among considerations. And of course, there's also salmonella, murine typhus, links to allergy. So there are a lot of and of course, historically plague. So there are a lot of potential concerns related to rodents. And of course, they're very destructive to our environment, our native animals, as well as destructive to many of our objects like electrical wiring, screens, and similar types of things. So we also kind of recommend an integrated strategy. And it's kind of a cyclical process. First of all, just as Dave mentioned, understanding the pest and the things that they like can be very useful. And in the case of rodents, understanding their behavior and their biology, their reproductive capacity allows us to kind of address some of their strengths and the things that they look for, as well as exploiting their weaknesses. So one of the first things you should be trying to implement is identifying places and inspecting your premises. Try and look for places where rodents can thrive and the sorts of situations they thrive in. There is some overlap with snails and slugs, such as the need for moisture, moist conditions, the need for harborage. So if you can eliminate certain kinds of harborage situations, you can actually reduce the potential for as well as slugs and snails. And then once you kind of have done some inspection, you can actually begin to take action. And one of the first things we try to do is create a less habitable environment, similar to some of the recommendations that Dave suggested. And so any kind of permanent controls really are very cost-effective and beneficial for the long run, for the long term. And of course, in many situations, especially here in Hawaii, we'll probably need to utilize traps or bait stations as well, because just cultural kinds of controls, environmental types of controls may not be sufficient to really reduce the the number of rodents. And then following some kinds of actions you want to monitor, scouting, inspecting, things like that are always part of a good integrated practice. And then you continue to take action as you see fit and as the prevalence or presence of rodents begins to increase again. So when we start to look at things that are important related to their biology and their behavior, first and foremost, they're very prolific. Generally in the wild, we believe they have about a 1-year life, but in some cases they can live up to 2 years. We also find that they're very, very reproductive, so they have the potential to really rapidly increase in numbers. And that's due to early maturity, short gestation, and the potential for year-round breeding here. So there's up to 6 to 8 litters per year, and generally there's probably 4 to 8 young in litters. They are nocturnal, so if you're seeing rodents during the day, that could be a sign that you have a really heavy high population in your area. All right, I think there's some folks maybe having conversations. If you could mute your.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, so another one is that these animals are commensal. And what that means is they actually have an affinity to live close to us. And they actually depend on us for shelter in some cases and also for food sources. So this is another kind of an avenue that we could take to reduce their potential to thrive where we're living. So we're the Aloha state, but this is a case where you may want to make your place a little bit less hospitable. I'm including mice in today's presentation, but really rats are of most concern as it relates to rat lungworm. But I know that mites can be problematic in production systems, especially for certain flower growers and certain fruits and vegetables as well. So mice are considered neophilic, and what that means is they're actually very naturally curious. And so they will readily explore new things in their environment, and it's one of the ways that we can exploit them and capture them. Rats, on the other hand, are called neophobic, and what that means is they're shy or fearful of new objects. So if you're trying to capture rats or bait for rats, you may need some patience. You want to put that device into your environment and leave it in one place until they get kind of accustomed to it. So it may take more than a week or more for you to begin to see activity at your bait station or your trap or something like that. They're also omnivorous, so they take advantage of things that are available in the environment. They do tend to like fresh vegetables and seeds, though, so when they have the option, they prefer food sources that are healthy and fresh and nutritious for them. It is possible, especially in an agricultural production system, to try and eliminate food as much as possible. So if you have a lot of culled materials, you want to make sure that they're buried deeply or removed so they don't act as a source for rodent feeding. You can also make sure that around your packing areas, your post-harvest areas, you don't have food sources and draw them in.
Oh, there. I bought a huge thing from Costco.
Maybe you can
jump in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you can find them.
So we're going to take a short little break here because we are hearing some folks coming through, and we're going to try to mute those folks who.
Hope they got everybody something from Costco.
Let's see. Looks like.
While we're waiting, are mongoose considered a rodent?
They are, yeah, I believe so.
They part of the cycle.
No, they're not. So we're most concerned about rats for this. Of course, they can have some agricultural implications. They tend to,
Yep. All right. Hopefully you folks can hear us a little better. Fast. Oh, slides, oh, slides. Why can't you see your slide? There you go.
All right, thank you. All right, sorry about that. So another advantage of eliminating food sources is then it allows the bait stations or traps to be a little bit more appealing to the rodents. If they have a really great food source, they may not be attracted to the types of incentives you're using to capture them. Another aspect of their biology or their behavior actually is that they're very agile and acrobatic. So in some cases, they're excellent climbers. They're capable of jumping more than 6 feet. So we often recommend people prune from trees from around their roofs or post-harvest sheds or things like that. They're also capable of squeezing into really very tiny spaces. Anything greater than 1/4 inch can allow entry to rodents. So in the picture shown there, you can see that they can certainly utilize the space around that screen. So as part of your inspection process, you really want to look for aerial routes that may be being utilized to gain entry and look around for really tiny openings. They're they have very powerful teeth and jaws, so they can actually chew through a lot of types of materials, and they've even been known to chew through like glass and soft concrete when they're really motivated. So you may need to really increase the types of screening that you're using or something like that if you find that they're gaining entry. Rats tend to move and migrate in areas less than 200 feet, so they do have ranges and territories. Mice tend to be much confined to much smaller distances, 10 to 30 feet. So again, understanding that movement allows you to maybe design a baiting or trapping system that doesn't overburden you with a lot of stations to maintain, but does cover the area around your farm and adjacent to post-harvest areas or things like that. Oftentimes people will place stations around structures and then outside around the peripheries of fields or things like that. Another aspect is that they're thigmophilic, meaning that they're touch-loving, and they actually use some of the parts of their face and guard hairs to help them navigate. So that's one of the reasons that they tend to like to stick near along walls or runways, and it's a place that we can begin to recognize where they would be likely to travel, and then you can place some of your either your bait stations or your traps along those same conducive runways. They have very acute senses. They have a great sense of smell. This allows them to locate food, their pathways to understand where their territories and where other competing rodents may live. There's also use of pheromones. Those are found in their urine, their feces, and their within their body odors. And they have a really acute sense of taste. So one of the things that means is you can't just use any kind of old or degraded baits and hope that they will work. They can actually develop bait shyness by sensing toxicity within the food that's being offered to them as well. So you want to make sure that you're replacing your baits monthly if you're using them. And if you're finding that shyness is developing, you want to switch to a different type of bait or a different type of attractant within it. There are a lot of signs that you have a rodent problem or that they're present on your farm or around your house. Gnawing is a very common one. Rodents need to chew continually to maintain their teeth at the proper level. There's also prevalence of rodent droppings in infested areas. It's very easy to, very noticeable. Sometimes you'll encounter nesting materials or find nests in boxes or when you're cleaning out areas. Sometimes you'll smell live or dead rodents. The urine from a rodent is a very strong odor and that you can learn to recognize. They do tend to make burrows, so you can look for cracks in walls or beneath the foundations or things like that. If you're hearing a lot of sounds in the ceiling or other places, that's another common sign that people will hear. And finally, there are rub marks. Because they don't wash themselves, they get a very oily exterior of their body and their hairs. And when they continually use the same walkways or entry points, they'll begin to leave behind traces of that. And over time, it becomes really noticeable. And again, it might even be associated with an odor. So the signs of rodents are really apparent. You don't really have to, generally you don't have to guess if you have a problem. It's noticeable in a lot of different ways. So as part of the inspection process, now that we kind of understand some characteristics of the rodent or the rat, as I just mentioned, looking for the harborage areas. And we find in the pictures below, there's a lot of examples of an environment that's really conducive for a rodent problem. Farms, just by their nature of having a lot of materials on hand, can really be conducive for rodents to begin to develop and live. As I mentioned, the 1/4-inch openings, categorizing them and taking action to change those so that they're no longer accessible. You want to look behind washers and dryers. In a lot of kind of packing situations, it's recommended that you don't put things directly against the wall or directly on the floor, so you can actually inspect beneath them and along the walls. And that'll show you whether or not there's rodent dropping. And also, it reduces the numbers of places that they can actually begin to live. They won't tend to congregate in open spaces where they feel vulnerable. And of course, a big one is uncovered food sources. So if you have pets or animals, you want to make sure that the food you're feeding them, especially if it's food-based, dog foods as well, tend to be very appealing. So pet foods, animal foods, if you can cover them up or maintain them in their sealed original containers, it really helps to eliminate a lot of appeal for the rodents. And of course, fruit trees, as much as possible, if you can eliminate or reduce the amount of fruit that's left after it falls, it reduces a lot of different pests and not just rodents. And composting as well. You want to bury fresh materials deep within your compost pile, and that helps reduce some of the appeal of the composting areas. Some other things you can do is reduce water. That also helps with slugs and snails. As much as possible, if you can remove water sources, dump water holding containers. I also work with mosquitoes, so that's another good reason to dump water holding containers. You also, as I mentioned, eliminating the food sources, concealing kitchen scraps, removing debris and thin or cut back trees and vegetation. So anything around the home that could give them a place to harbor is important. In your field situations, if you can reduce harborage around the peripheries by mowing or some kind of herbiciding, that could also potentially help control snails and slugs and give them less of an entry point into your field and help to exclude them. And as I mentioned earlier, elevating piled materials, especially irrigation pipes. That's a really big one to make sure that you're elevating. Any kinds of trash should be covered. In urban areas, that's one of the biggest ways that rats are a problem. And any kinds of openings, make sure that they're closed and sealed. There are certain kinds of sheet metal collars that can be used around pipe inlets, things like that. Finally, we get to trapping. There are a lot of different types of traps on the market today. The good old-fashioned snap trap is still one of the best ones. Trapping is actually recommended for more indoor environments as opposed to using baits, just because animals, if they're baited and die from the poisoning, could actually die inside the structure and then create a really nasty odor problem. There are some food safety issues related to the use of traps, so you want to make sure you check on what kinds of traps are approved if you're using them in some kind of packing environment or post-harvest environment. Traps are also preferable for use around pets and other animals and children. You can utilize traps in a way that your pets can encounter them by placing them inside pipes or covering them so only rodents can gain entry. The slide is showing kind of a relatively new one. It's called the Good Nature Trap, and it actually resets itself. And with some of it's been used a lot in New Zealand and in natural areas, but it will actually last for 6 months without having to be reset or needing attention. So it's potentially a long-term control. In the lower corner, you can see some traditional snap traps, and actually the trigger has been expanded, and it's placed along a runway. And so the animal doesn't really actually use it as a food source, or the food isn't an attractant. It's actually relying on the rodent running along that path and then stepping on the snap trap. So you can actually expand the trigger of your snap traps, or you can buy some nowadays that actually have expanded trigger. You may also notice that there's a string attached to it, and that's usually used to anchor it in place so that it can't be dragged away or into an inaccessible area. There are some electronic traps that's pictured in the upper corner, and those, in many cases, you don't really have to look at the dead animal afterwards. You just dump it into the trash. The middle one is used for mouse control, and it's called the tin cat, and it takes advantage of the mouse's curious nature. And in that one, once one mouse goes in, the smell will also attract others. So they can gain entry, but they can't get back out. And in infestations, you can catch 10 to 20 mice in a night. If you're not catching a mouse in that area, it likely means that they're not there and you want to move them. As far as the types of baits that you can use for your traps, we found that coconut is really appealing, and you can actually pre-bait with shredded coconut and then put small chunks of coconut on the trigger as well. There are many other kinds of foods that you can use. Many people use nuts or seeds, and in some cases you can smear peanut butter on the corner of the trap and put kind of a teaser seed there. And then after they take that, they'll be drawn to the main, the trigger of the trap. So I covered most of this. Make sure that if you're checking, you need to check traps daily and to wear your gloves or PPE. And I mentioned about pre-baiting, and oftentimes, as it was shown there, you can set them perpendicular to the wall or in areas where they maybe that are more reclusive. There are available some kinds of monitoring devices to check where rats are prevalent, so you can use some of those. Sometimes they use dusts or powders. There are also things that they will gnaw on, and that lets you know where they're feeding, because in some cases, rats will be moving, but that's not an area that they associate with food or a safe environment for feeding. So there are some things you could find online to help make your trapping more effective. Finally, we'll cover a little bit about chemical suppression, the use of toxic baits. This is something that is a pesticide. It is regulated. You want to make sure you understand the label and its use. Bait should always be placed within bait stations. There are rules related to where those stations can be and how they need to be anchored to the ground so that other animals or non-target organisms can't gain entry. Generally, they're put right within the environment that rodents are found, either beneath decks, along runways, within harborage areas around the edges of your farm. Generally, we recommend placing them about 15 to 50 feet apart, and 75 to 100 feet apart if it's more in a peripheral of the property. In trying to protect or to prevent them from entering a packing area or a shed, oftentimes they're placed by where they might gain entry. So like on both sides of the door, you would probably put a bait station. And then maybe every 20 feet around the edge of that structure. As I mentioned, make sure that you understand and follow the label. And baits cannot remain inside of the stations indefinitely. Every month you should be replacing the bait. And you can see how much bait is missing and gives you a sense of how much activity is happening. If you'll notice in the picture, the bait is actually held within the station, so it can't be removed. Some people will just drop bait inside, but rats have a tendency to hoard, so they'll just drag all the cubes away, and your baiting activities will be much less effective. It also is important to keep the bait held within the station so it can't be shaken loose and other animals or children getting access to it. The vast majority of rodenticides are anticoagulants, and so you want to make sure that pets don't come in contact. There are antidotes, so if you suspect your animal has encountered a poison or consumed a dead rodent, you want to contact your veterinarian. There is a new product on the market that utilizes corn gluten. We actually haven't had a chance to evaluate it here at the Department of Health, but it does represent a less toxic solution that might appeal to some people. Finally, if you're successful at capturing or killing some of the animals, you'll have some disposal considerations. In most farm settings, you can certainly bury them deeply on site in a way that they won't be dug up by other animals. You can also place them inside sealed plastic bags and disposed of in the garbage. You want to avoid directly handling rodents, wear gloves and use tools. So for example, you could just pick up the dead rat with a shovel or something like that and then just use that to help bury it. And then when we think about cleaning up areas, there's a lot of reasons to do that. Certainly these contaminated areas represent different degrees of hazards, and they might have disease organisms or allergens. You want to, as much as possible, expose that area to sunlight and ventilate it before you go into your cleaning activities. You want to wear gloves and eyewear, covered footwear. I know of one person who probably contracted lepto because they cleaned a rodent-infested environment in slippers or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're using covered footwear as well, and potentially use a dust mask as well. We don't have a lot of the considerations or concerns as they do on the mainland with some of the airborne viruses, but it's just a generally good practice. Disinfectants, commercial disinfectants, or even 1 part bleach to 10 part water makes effective cleaning solutions. And as much as possible, you don't want to get these materials airborne, so avoid sweeping them up or vacuuming them up unless you have a really strong filter. So wiping the area clean and then mopping are some of the best practices. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks for bearing with me during my technical difficulties.